Well, good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of the LBJ School and the Strauss Center, let me welcome you to this very special event. It's my great privilege and honor to introduce my friend Nabil Fahmy, the Egyptian ambassador to the United States. Nabil is in the best tradition of a truly dedicated public servant who has given his entire career to representing Egypt and to working for the cause of peace and reconciliation in the Middle East, and somebody I've had a chance to work with extensively during my own career in government. Nabil has had a number of important posts both within the foreign ministry in Cairo and around the world, but I got to know him during the period 1993 to 1997, where he was the principal advisor, I think it's fair to say, within the foreign ministry on the Middle East peace process, as well as a key interlocutor between the United States and Egypt on important bilateral issues. And he is somebody who really worked as hard as anybody I know, and is with the kind of creativity, imagination, and commitment to a problem which we all recognize is one of the most important but difficult issues that we've had to face. And his contribution has been steady and steadfast, and despite the setbacks and the difficulties, he's remained committed and engaged, and even occasionally optimistic. I hope he'll share some of that with us today. After serving as the principal advisor on Middle East peace issues at the foreign ministry, he served for several years in Japan, which I suspect was a nice break for you, and then came back to serve as Egypt's ambassador in Washington, where he served for a number of years now, and with great distinction, and highly valued as an advisor not only to the administration but to Congress and people who care about these issues. And so we're very fortunate to have a chance to hear his perspective. There's obviously an extraordinary range of issues to talk about, not only with respect to the Israel-Palestinian issue, Egypt's relations with Israel, but more broadly on the questions of the trajectory of the Middle East and some of the broader challenges in the region. So I'm enormously grateful that he took the time to come visit us here in Austin, and I ask you to join me in welcoming His Excellency Nabil Fahmy.
Thank you, Jim. It's always great to see you. And just before lunch, just before coming here, we had a brief chance to reminisce about previous work, and I've truly enjoyed our friendship, and I take tremendous pride in getting into intellectual debates with him. And he tends to sort of challenge my attempts to be diplomatic and get around difficult issues. I'm extremely happy to be here. I've been trying to get to Austin for a number of years now. I've always ended up in Dallas and Houston. But I'm finally here, and I want to take the occasion to sort of get off topic for a second. Most of my speeches start off with the Arab-Israeli conflict, and they ultimately end up at the same point because it's so difficult to deal with. Occasionally, post 9/11, it's been about Islam, who we are as an Arab society. I'd like to try to merge both. Consequently, I'll be touching on a lot of topics, most of them quite briefly, just by way of giving you a sense of where my thoughts are, where my convictions are. And as I think is expected, I would be really happy to take any questions you'd like afterwards on these issues in more detail, or even by way of challenging what I present to you. Let me start by saying, as an Egyptian, with 7,000 years of history behind us, we're used to living in a region that has a large number of challenges and a large number of opportunities at the same time. What is different now is, on the one hand, the world is so much smaller, and therefore everything that's happening around the region is also being fed into the region, into our own mindset, into how we calibrate our opinions, how we compare our achievements to others or our failures to others. And what's also changed is we're having all these problems or all these challenges at the same time. A number of very serious issues all have come at the same time, and it's mind-boggling, even for a country with 7,000 years of history. A couple of points. I don't need to make them here in this kind of audience, but I will, because I've tended to make them with most American public audiences. I think while most foreigners tend to look at the Middle East and either see the Arab-Israeli conflict or oil, it's important to understand there's more to it than that. That's why it's more complex, that's why it's more challenging, and that's why there are more opportunities than simply whether we produce oil or whether we can solve the Arab-Israeli conflict. Strategically, by where we're situated, especially in the case of my country, Africa, we're actually the only country that has territory both in Africa and Asia, a link between Europe and the East. The Middle East spreads from Morocco on the Atlantic right through into the Persian Gulf. So it's located in a very strategic, important area, whether you're interested in maritime commerce, security lanes, or the political issues that we face in energy. I'd add to it that while it tends to be homogeneous, it's not identical in all the countries. Most of the Middle East, out of about 300 million, most of it are Arabs. Most of them are Muslims. But there is a Christian community, again, in my country alone, about 10% Christian community, Copts and Catholics and other disciplines. And there are a number of Jews also, and there are different Muslims as well, between Shiites and Sunnis and so on. And frankly, the Middle Easterners in the Maghreb, in the North African Maghreb, have a historical experience that is much closer linked to Europe than the Middle Easterners in the Gulf area, or that, for example, my own country, Egypt, in the center. And that defines how they define themselves. I'm making these points because, in my mind, the greatest challenge the Middle East faces today is defining its identity. We've been defined more often than not, either only by the fact that most of us speak Arabic, or by how you see us rather than who we are. And frankly, in a global society today, where all of our commonality and all of our differences are magnified, we, as Middle Easterners, are challenged to determine exactly who we are. In the beginning of the Egyptian revolution, there was a huge tide of Arab nationalism, an era where we saw decolonization from European colonization, and which extended throughout the Middle East into Africa and well beyond. And it was very easy for a Middle Easterner to say, I'm an Arab. At least most of us did. And we understood who we were. I don't want to say the demise of Arab nationalism, because I think it still exists, but with the success of the decolonization process, the main force behind Arab nationalism has, in many ways, decreased, and Middle Easterners today are looking for a different way to define themselves. One of the reasons why it's so difficult for us, we are a changing region. I often joke that Egypt, and it's correct actually, is 7,000 years old, and Americans tend to look at us as an old country. But we have an extremely young population. 56% of our population is 25 years or younger. 25% of everybody living in the Middle East lives in Egypt. About 300 million Middle Easterners. Of those 300 million, 76 million live in Egypt. So for any young generation, it is natural for them to try to search for their role in life, their place in life, their identity. And this generation is facing a situation where they're not linked to Arab nationalism, but they're Arabs because that's the main language that they've used, and that's been part of most of their history. They're looking in a much more global context towards the world. the Middle East is also the birthplace of the three monotheistic religions. So religion is a very big issue in our part of the world. And consequently, as many of you have followed, one of the ways people identify themselves now is, well, are we Muslim or are we Christian or are we Jewish? Are we Shiite or are we Sunni? Even further than that, and I can go on and say Alawite, and we can go on and on about who's what. This is another issue that has come up and become very prominent in trying to determine who we are. So our greatest challenge, frankly, is determining who we are and what role we will play in the international community. And I'm making this last point because as the search for identity emerged, two basic trends also emerged. One, calling for going back to the fundamentals, which is basically going back to our core, going back to our faith, and falling back on that. And another trend, which felt we want to actually join the modern world and be Western. Or, I'm simplifying it, be modern, which was another way of saying we want to be Western rather than be Arab. So you have this challenge that we're facing between, in the search for identity, do we go back to our fundamentals and try to emphasize who we are in our own region, or do we go out and try to become somebody who we are not? My answer to this, frankly, is a bit different. I think it's important for us to engage the world, to engage the world with our own values, our own issues, our own experiences, be more progressive, active players in the international agenda, rather than trying to be more French, more Italian, more American, or more Chinese. And that's really, again, a challenge that we're facing in our part of the world. Now, to have the tools to do what I'm suggesting, one of the practical challenges is economic and social development. You're not going to be able to be an effective player worldwide unless you are an economic and social force over and above the military aspect of all of that. But I don't think a military force is sustainable long-term if you don't have an economic and social background. So, again, a major challenge will be, can we move from being underdeveloped countries to developing countries to developed countries? And as we do that, engage in economic and social development and put forward our agenda to the world as a whole. Let me just throw out to you a couple of figures. Again, using my own country as the example. 15 years ago, 70% of Egypt's GDP came from the public sector, government-owned companies. Today, 67% of Egypt's GDP comes from the private sector in Egypt. In other words, what we've been trying to do back home is empower, again, the private sector. By empowering the private sector, you have more stakeholders in the economic marketplace, but also in developing social ideas and the social agenda domestically. And as a function of that, we have seen last year 7% growth, the year before 6.9% growth, because the economic forces in Egypt are now feeling that they have a stake in moving forward. As they become more creative, they start challenging social norms. And you have debates that are occurring back home about our political system, our social system, the role of religion in our societies. And a debate that, regrettably, because it's at the beginning, is turning more often than not into them and us. And it's a debate which I see also evolving internationally occasionally. And it's a very dangerous trend. On the one hand, we're doing the right things in creating jobs, to encourage social economic development and therefore more stakeholders. But we need to buy some time so that the debate can rationalize into a situation where people realize that this has to be a win-win situation for people in the Middle East. It can't be about them and us in the Middle East. It can't be about Christians and Muslims. It can't be about Sunnis and Shiites. It can't be about Kurds and Arabs, Israelis or Arabs. It has to be a win-win situation. And of course, it can't be about them and us on an international level either. I mentioned these examples because I actually think that the most challenging, the most pressing immediate challenge in the Middle East is to create jobs with a very, very young population throughout the Middle East, with growing economies, with economic and social change. We need to create jobs, particularly for the less affluent members of our society. If we do that, I am confident that the Middle East will move into, will be a more progressive force in affirming a Middle Eastern agenda on world affairs, but also be a more constructive player in world affairs. In the absence of creating jobs, you will find a more frustrated population in the Middle East, because in an era of globalization, my children and your peers see themselves as competitors with their peers around the world. It's not about competition with the young man or young lady next door. It's about why I can't be the next Bill Gates of the world or the next Nobel Prize laureate of the world. You cannot create that reality unless you give people hope, and you cannot do that without creating jobs for the younger generation. In Egypt alone, we need to create 750,000 new jobs every year. Now, you can extrapolate that throughout the Middle East, and you will see that that is the fundamental challenge for the younger generation. I started off with these points because they are what I call generic challenges throughout the Middle East. They may be a bit more acute, any one of them, may be a bit more acute in North Africa or in the center, like a country like Egypt or in the Gulf. But at the end of the day, these challenges that I mentioned, and I can go on with many others, frankly exist throughout our region. They ultimately are or can be summarized as trying to define our identity and our role in the future of our region and that of the world. There are another set of challenges that, while they are important to all the Middle East and to many others around the world, are not necessarily regional challenges, but are more topical, more geocentric to certain areas of the Middle East. And they're the ones that, more often than not, are highlighted in the press. The Arab-Israeli conflict, Iraq, Iran. We can go on, talk about Lebanon, Sudan, and issues like this. And I'd like to touch on some of those issues very quickly. And then I will close by what I think is the particular role for America and Egypt in this whole dilemma and paradigm. I'm not sure whether I've been doing the Middle East peace process for too long, and consequently I'm sort of used to failure, or in order to justify having done it for so long, I'm an eternal optimist. But I'm doing it, and I'm still speaking about it. I want to share with you my assessment of where we are, with a particular focus on the Palestinian-Israeli element of the peace process. We, today, I believe, are in a situation of unique clarity and acute disbelief at the same time. And Jim and I go back a long way, and we can both remember times when we weren't exactly sure whether the Palestinians and Israelis would ever discuss specific issues or several of these sensitive issues. That's not the case today. Palestinians and Israelis, formally and informally, have discussed everything they have to discuss. Palestinians and Israelis in the center understand, actually all Palestinians and Israelis understand, that if you're going to achieve a peace based on a two-state solution, if that's the objective, achieving an Arab-Israeli peace based on two states, you will have to address the issue of Jerusalem, the issue of refugees, the issue of territory, and the issue of security. Everything you can think of will fall under those four headlines. On both sides, I am confident that the center on both sides understands that if you're going to get a deal, not what they want, but if you are going to get a deal where both sides agree, the solution on Jerusalem will be that Jerusalem will be the capital of two states. It will be an open city. And there will be special arrangements with bilateral and mutual guarantees regarding the religious sites in particular. There will not be a two-state solution without Jerusalem being the capital of Palestine and Israel. The issue of refugees. More time than a lot of time has been spent on debating the right of Palestinians to return to Israel. And I think, frankly, that's the wrong approach to dealing with this issue. It's not about one side's right or the other side's right. If one wants to get into a legalistic debate, the rights are enshrined in international law, in UN documents, in the basis for the establishment of the State of Israel and the resolutions adopted thereafter. What it's about is how do we exercise that right? We're wasting our time if we debate the right. What we should negotiate is how do you exercise that right? The only way to exercise that right that's consistent with achieving a two-state solution is to do it in a manner where most of the Palestinians, where the Palestinians will have the right of return or compensation, but that will be exercised in a manner that does not change the nature of the State of Israel. Issue of territory. For the third time, I underline, if we're assuming that we're going to have peace based on a two-state solution, the territory of the Palestinian state will be essentially the same size of the territory occupied in 1967 in Gaza and the West Bank. That's what it's going to be, or you're not going to have a deal. Whether it's exactly the same territory or simply the same size territory is something that can be discussed to unify some villages, some towns, but that's not going to change substantively the nature of the basic concept of ending occupation. There will not be a solution without that happening. And finally, well, 2 points to close on this point. The final element is security. On the one hand, when I started working on security years ago, it was about security against existential threats, about security between nation states. So it was quite easy to put together a formula for security between Egypt and Israel. And then it would have been easy to put together a formula for security between a Palestinian state and Israel. But if you look at the actual security problems today, it's not about an existential threat to Israel. It's not about an existential threat to the Palestinians. It's about the individual security of Palestinians and Israelis. So what we will need to do in this fourth element of the package is create a dual security system where, on the one hand, you do not allow for surprise attacks against either side to ensure that the particular Palestinian territory is not used as a launching point for third parties. And you will have to have arrangements between the Palestinian and the Israeli state to ensure that personal security on both sides is assured as much as you can. What's different today on the positive side of the package is not only is there this intense clarity, there's also, frankly, an offer from the Arab side that if the occupation ends, not only will there be peace between Palestine and Israel, Syria and Israel, but there will be peace and normalization between all the Arab countries and Israel. So there's a regional dimension here that goes farther beyond the conflict resolution component, and which plays into the last point I was making about security, where you end all reasons for conflict and friction. Now, I also said we're at a point of acute disbelief. As clear as the solution is, and I say this in complete sincerity, any rational Israeli or Palestinian will describe for you the exact same package if he starts from the premise that I agree to have a two-state solution. The disbelief is that neither side believes the other one wants to do it or is able to do it. Palestinians argue that, well, in spite of all of the statements coming out of Israel, they're still building settlements. They're still targeting killings, and so on and so forth. There's still the debate about Jerusalem, so they can't possibly be serious, the Israelis. And the Israelis are saying, as long as there's violence coming from the other side, particularly from Gaza, and as long as President Abu Mazen cannot control the security situation, then he may be a nice guy, but he can't deliver on this issue, and therefore I don't believe peace is possible. I very often underline that while I see with tremendous clarity what the solution should be, I despair from what I quite often call the two Ds, demographics and demonization. If we don't resolve this issue in the near term, demographics between the West Bank and Gaza and inside Israel will make it very, very difficult 5-10 years from now to create a two-state solution that responds to these parameters. And frankly, if we don't solve this in the near term, the amount of intolerance, hatred, and demonization that's existing on both sides will ultimately make it very difficult for politicians to take the steps necessary to bring a deal to closure. Because the package is clear, demonization is the tool and the excuse used not to strike the deal. So you will see more of it in the years to come if we don't have a solution in the near term. I'm going to touch upon a number of regional issues and then come back to the U.S. role and the Egyptian role, for that matter, because it comes across all of these issues. Not only do we have the longest ongoing conflict in the region, which is the Arab-Israeli conflict, we have now a unique situation in Iraq where almost all of the challenges I mentioned and many others come together in one country. If you look at the Iraqi situation, you have all of the conflicts between ethnic groups, all of the conflicts between peoples in the region, neighboring states trying to define their identity, all of the conflicts regarding who has control, who has power over resources, given the potential that Iraq has, and all of the baggage of 50 years and more of violence in the Middle East, as well as the engagement of foreign powers. Our position as Egypt, as I'm sure you all know, which was supportive of the American position on the first war against Iraq, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, was against the second war against Iraq, not out of support for Saddam, but because for a country the size of ours, unless there's a clear attack against you, the only way force is justified is with the Security Council resolution, and that didn't exist at the beginning of the war. Having made that point for the record, the Iraqi situation is very tenuous. The surge may militarily be having an effect. It should have an effect militarily. The issue is, can it be sustainable if American forces dress down or are reduced, and can the Iraqis pick up the burden of that? More importantly, has enough been done on the political domain as the surge has provided a sense of increased security? Because if that hasn't occurred, once you remove that pressure, you will ultimately get into the Sunni Shiite arguments, the Arab-Persian arguments, the Kurdish-Arab arguments, the arguments about who controls the resources. And of course, the tragedy of Iraq is there's so much bloodshed and hatred that it's the Iraqis, the Iraqi militias, many of the Iraqi politicians are really tearing at the seams of Iraq as a nation state. I think America, because, and I'll go out of my program here, America as the head of the international coalition has to, on the one hand, make it clear that it will not withdraw in a precipitous manner from Iraq, but that it intends to withdraw from Iraq. You need to intensify the work you're doing with the Iraqi forces and the Iraqi politicians to shorten the time span between now and when they can take control of their own country. I would not encourage you to withdraw before that happens, but I do encourage you to give clear evidence that you intend to withdraw, because the continued presence of America in Iraq endlessly is not a solution to this problem. We will have to get into an understanding with the neighboring states if you want to solve the problems inside Iraq. That will require dealing with Turkish security concerns, Syrian security concerns, Iranian security concerns, Saudi security concerns, concerns of Jordan, even concerns of countries like my own that have influence in our region. And I frankly think that to do that, we need to have at least two channels of discussions with the 5 permanent members in attendance. One on general security issues. What are my interests, my concerns? What are those of the other countries? How do we balance them out so it's not a zero-sum game? And how do you balance those out with the role of the United States and the coalition members? Of course, prominent among that will be the unique situation between Iran and the West. The other channel or conference has to be about weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. We have serious concerns about the Iranian nuclear program if it is weaponized. We do not question Iran's right to pursue peaceful nuclear programs, provided they are fully compliant with their safeguard agreements with the International Atomic Energy Agency. And there still is a lack of clarity as to why they did what they've done and, frankly, how far they've done. But I make this point because it's not going to be resolved unless we discuss this issue clearly in a forthright manner, and it will not be resolved, frankly, if we look at it only as the Iranian proliferation issue. Countries pursue weaponization programs out of a perception of their security concerns, rightly or wrongly. And they tend to be concerns in their own region. We don't all look global. As much as we are strong supporters of nuclear disarmament, I don't waste much time on trying to convince America to give up its nuclear weapons. My focus is on my own region. If I can get that solved, I'll give Jim a hard time. To deal with the Iranian issue, we need to highlight the concerns regarding their program, and then we need to also deal with the Israeli program as well. And I put them in that order, not because it's a sequence, but because I think there's a sense of urgency on the Iranian issue that should not be ignored. But you won't get a solution unless you have the same standard applying to everybody in the Middle East. Now, I've talked about the neighboring states around Iraq. But let me also say, Iraqis will have to revisit their constitution. It has to be redrafted in some of its parts to ensure that, and applied in a manner to ensure that whether you're a Kurd, a Shiite, or a Sunni, whether you live in the northern Iraq or in the south, or in Kirkuk, that it is more beneficial to you and your community to remain part of Iraq than to be a Kurd, a Sunni, or a Shia. If you have a federation that is too loose, you will end up ultimately seeing Iraq break away into small parts. And that would have ramifications, frankly, at least throughout the Gulf area. If you look at the imbalance between Sunni and Shia and the Persian influence, you will see that imbalance affecting the security of many states in the region. I know somebody will say, well, the British drew all those boundaries. They did. Erasing them is equally dangerous. Let me move to Lebanon for just a minute, and then I will close. I mean, Lebanon is a country, it's really unique in our part of the world. It has no natural resources except its people. It's been able to create a marvelous country, extremely productive society, out of almost nothing. It has more communities in a small country like Lebanon than we have in a country that's 4 or 5 times, if not more, larger in size. At the same time, it tears itself apart every 15 years. Mostly because the Lebanese formula has brought people together while they continue to hold strongly, again, to their ethnic identity as well as being Lebanese. And that not only leads to frictions arising whenever there's hot air in the region, but it also encourages others to interfere in dealing with the internal domestic politics in Lebanon. Lebanon has to be an independent state governed by the Lebanese alone. We are trying to find a way to ensure that they elect their president and find a formula where no party in Lebanon will have, if you want, veto power on what decisions are taken by the Lebanese government, with ultimately the power of the presidency being the decisive force between the different sectors in Lebanon. Whether it is the influence of Iran, Western influence, Syrian influence, it has to stop. And it has to be, again, an issue of Lebanese identity. I make this point, although I'm not offering a solution to it, because if we are able to get over this stumbling block of getting an elected president in Lebanon and a foundation for a Lebanese government, the Lebanese have to revisit their own domestic package in order not to face the same problem 15 years down the line. Yes, foreign forces have to withdraw from trying to influence the situation in Lebanon, but the Lebanese have to learn from their own experiences. If we can give them that opportunity, and we should, they should make their own decisions. They have to revisit the domestic situation and come up with a formula that is more Lebanese than ethnic. I've mentioned just some of the issues that, political issues that I think are important to me and important to our region. Given the complexity of these issues and how many of them have come to a boil at the same time, I haven't mentioned Darfur or the situation between North and South in Sudan or the whole issue of terrorism. The region will not be able to deal with these problems if prominent countries globally and regionally do not play a very progressive, proactive role in dealing with these issues. I don't think that any of the issues I mentioned can be dealt with without American activism. And I mean American activism, I don't mean acting for the sake of acting. I mean deciding when to do something and when not to do something. But you can't remain, I'm talking about a surge in diplomatic activity with all the sophistication and complexity that that involves. Arabs and Israelis will not be able, particularly Palestinians and Israelis, to reach an agreement if there is not active American diplomacy towards peace between Arabs and Israelis. The situation in Lebanon will not be resolved unless America takes a position, not necessarily sending, I'm not asking for a negotiator to go there, but I'm talking about America taking positions about the region that are consistent with the points that I've been making. This on Iran or on Iraq. America, of course, is a very prominent player in that those issues as well. What I would do differently, if I can say that, I've been here for 7 years, so I can take that risk, I suppose. A little bit more diplomacy, but I take liberties with my American hosts. You need to change your mindset. You continue to look at the world as if you're a superpower. But there's no other superpower out there. And when you posture yourself as a superpower, your foreign policy is a function of competition with an adversary or a function of fear that your security interests here or there, your influence will be affected. You need to change your perspective. America in a global environment has to be the global power. Like your business community. Your business community invests in opportunities and calculates risks and balance sheets, what to do, what not to do, where to draw the line. If you don't invest in opportunities around the world, you will not be able to face problems that, like endemic disease, for example, if you don't invest in sub-Saharan Africa, if you can't convince your constituency that you need to put money in Mali, a small country that not many of you here, but many in America don't know where it actually is. You have to have an investment where your politicians feel they're accountable by their people for foreign policy decisions. Up until today, if you follow the debate about Iraq in America, it's not about foreign policy, it's about the troops. It's about domestic policy. You cannot, as the leader of the modern world, only determine your foreign policy based on who's threatening you from abroad. And unless you stop doing that and I urge you to change posture, the world would not be a better place. We can't succeed in dealing with these 4 or 5 issues that I mentioned, among many others, unless America is looking at its long-term investment rather than parochial politics or the immediate problems of today. Egypt has something to do as well. Egyptians love to say that we're the pioneers in the Middle East, and we are. We love to say that we're the mother of the world, and well, we are. But what I found in America very often is, and I go around speaking and I don't have such a generous host as Jim to introduce me, I've never had to introduce myself as being the ambassador from Egypt, because most Egyptians take some Egyptian history, Americans, take some Egyptian history in school. But the problem I faced, frankly, is Americans look at us and look backwards. It's all about our history. And it's not your fault. It's because we need to talk about our future, not only about what we have done. We need to be more assertive in terms of this is what we will do. Whether America likes it or doesn't like it, France likes it or doesn't like it, we need to more and more try to play an active role in determining an agenda for change in the world. And I use this phrase carefully because I think it's been misused quite often politically. When I'm talking about an agenda for change, I don't mean changing somebody else. I mean changing myself. We're not in the politics of trying to change you into becoming Egyptian. What I'm talking about is we need to embrace change confidently in a manner where we become better Egyptians. I don't want to be an American. I'll be very candid with you. I was born here, and I'm not an American. Not because I have a position that's anti-American, but I'm a proud Egyptian. But I also understand I can be a better Egyptian if I embrace change, if I'm confident in bringing out my values to the world, disagreeing or agreeing with you, and trying to find a way to move forward. We cannot bank on our achievements. And the Middle East, frankly, will suffer considerably if we do not. Egypt's most substantial contribution to the Middle East has been its intellectual integrity. Over the years, more political, social, and economic trends in the Middle East have come out of Egypt than any other country in our region. And that will continue to be the same if not only because of the demographic nature of the region. So my commitment to you is that as a government official, while we will always remain true to our values and we will debate, agree, and disagree with you, we will continue to try to change and look at the world in a more global fashion. Because if we don't, we won't be able to resolve many of our own challenges. And frankly, it will be at the expense of our own national goals, but also that of our friends like those in America. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Nabil, for that characteristically thoughtful and far-ranging talk. We have a microphone here, and I'm going to turn to the audience for questions in a second, but if I could begin with the prerogative of the chair to ask you a question tying together your beginning with your end. In the beginning, you talked about the challenge of social and economic development, and in the end, you talked about change. There's been a lot of focus in recent years on the Arab Human Development Report from the UN. There have now been 2 major studies on this. And one of the things that it's focused on, a number of very interesting aspects of the challenge, but one of the most important that's gotten a lot of attention is the issue of governance and the question of how governance relates to social and economic development. And obviously here we've had a great debate over the past 6 years about the role of democratization as part of that. And so I wonder if you could say just a word about your own perspective on that and how democratization and governance relates to the change that you're talking about and how you see that progressing and what you would like to see from the United States on that agenda.
Sure. That's an excellent question. As I said, in order to meet the first series of challenges that I mentioned that relate to all of the Middle East, a very important component will be economic and social development. We have to correct our education system. We have to develop more technology. We have to let loose the creative capacities in our society. I have no question in my mind that all that has to happen. At the same time, I need to create jobs. Creating jobs means attracting investment. Investors want to have a sense of stability or the ability to calculate the risk that they're going to take, because they can either do it in Egypt, in Colombia, in Malaysia, or anywhere else in the world. And I'm talking not about foreign investors, even Egyptian investors. So we need to achieve this balance. We cannot say we want stability without change, because then you dampen our own creativity. And we cannot simply open up the situation without considered thinking, because you ultimately lose the sense of stability. Let me just give some context to this. As a government official, I go around America and Egypt saying, we need more democracy in Egypt. I have no hesitation in saying that, because that's the formal government position. We are trying to do that. And we are realistic and rational about that there are some challenges to us as we try to do that. We may even make some mistakes as we do that. But let's put things in context. 2 years ago, we elected a president with more than, 2 years ago, for the first time in 7,000 years, not in 50 years, in 7,000 years, we had an election for president with more than one candidate in a direct vote. You may take this for granted, but we have never done this before. Yes, we had more than one candidate in elections, but they were in parliament. It was not a direct vote. Secondly, we used to have a one-party centralized system. In a minute, when President Nasser came into office after the revolution, understandably, his priority was social equity. He felt that the country was owned by a small elite. It wasn't about democracy. His priority was social equity. When Sadat came into office, his priority was liberating the Sinai. President Mubarak came into office because President Sadat was killed, so his priority was security and stability. The serious debate about re-entering democracy into Egypt only really started about 15 years ago. We touched upon it during Nasser and during Sadat, but it only really gained ground in the last 15 years. Today we have 22 parties. Many of them are inconsequential. We have a multi-party system. We do not yet have a competitive party system. That comes with time. It comes with experience, with practice. We have, 50, 100 papers coming out in Egypt every week. 10 at most were the former government-owned papers that are now owned by the Senate. Most of the press, however, is completely unrelated to the past. Legally, it's a free press. Are we having the right public debate? No, it's maturing. But it's not because the laws prohibit that. It's because the society is still evolving. We're having debates about freedom of speech, for example. There were cases recently where the government challenged some of the editors in what they had done, and it took them to court on these issues. As a society, we're trying to define where exactly are the limits of freedom of speech. And don't let anybody kid you and tell you that they don't exist everywhere in the world. France and Germany. If you deny the Holocaust, it's a crime. In America, you're more liberal. But if you cry fire in a movie theater and there are losses, you will be held liable. Each society determines what exactly are the limits of freedom of speech. We haven't yet done that properly. We're trying to. One of the most sensitive issues is the issue of religion, not the issue of criticizing politicians, frankly. One of the sensitive issues is what exactly can or can't you do about, and say about religion, for example. On the issue of good governance, the real challenge we've had in Egypt has not been the lack of democracy. It's been over-centralization. We're trying to decentralize authority both in government and within society, and that takes time. I think we have moved very significantly on the issues of good governance, on issues of democracy, but we're not where we want to be as an Egyptian government. Over and above, we're not where we want to be as an Egyptian people. That takes time to go through the exercise, learn from your own mistakes, and determine what exactly the limits and the liberties are that your society wants.
Okay, questions, please. Just if you come down to the mics here.
Ambassador, hi. My question is, forgive me for being America-centric, but in this primary season where we're trying to choose presidential candidates, which, I guess as a diplomat, it's difficult to endorse or share information on politics, but what is more beneficial to Egypt and the Middle East in general? Is it a candidate, say, who's interested in withdrawing or slowing down maybe the economic globalization of America, but changing military strategy and maybe becoming more diplomatic or involved in the Middle East? Or is it someone who continues the economic globalization, spreading the wealth around a little bit, but maybe being stronger on the military strategies towards controlling Middle East policy?
I understand your question. It's difficult for me to say either or. And I've gotten into trouble last elections because I wrote an article. I, of course, didn't endorse anybody, but it was interpreted by the other party that I was endorsing. I want an internationalist president for America. That's what the world needs, not what Egypt needs. We need an internationalist president for America. He can apply that to foreign policy, to the military, to the economy. It may not always be to our benefit, by the way. But given America's scope of interest and influence, in the long term, it will help the world and help Egypt and America if you have an internationalist president.
Thank you for your presentation. I believe that you said that the Israeli-Palestinian situation is the key to what's going on in the Middle East. If that is the key, if that is the case, and they are the key, what took the United States so long to focus on that problem, and what could this new international president do? What could be done? What would be the strongest thing that could be done now if you have said that that is the big problem?
Well, there's no one key, of course, to all the problem. It's the problem that has the most effect on everything else. I think what is required of an American president, be that the president that exists today or a Republican or a Democratic president elected next November, is to pursue peace in the Middle East as an American national interest. Not because you're a supporter of Israel or the Arab world. If you pursue peace in the Middle East as America's national interest, this will allow you to use and sell the issue to your own constituency, because it's going to be a hard sell. You're going to have to sit down with Arabs and Israelis, use all your powers of persuasion, use some of your domestic assets as well, use your international assets to get support for the whole process. And unless you project this as projected here in America, that you're doing this for America, not for Arabs or for Israelis, and if you don't project it in the Middle East, that they need to respond to America, not only to each other, we'd be losing a tremendous opportunity.
Given that Hamas was formed as an outgrowth of the Brotherhood, how strong would you say the links are today between Hamas and the Brotherhood, and how concerned is the Mubarak regime of the rise of Hamas in Gaza, the instability in Gaza, given its own internal concerns of an Islamist uprising?
I would argue that ideologically they're basically playing to the same music. Plus Hamas has, in addition to that, a national cause, which is ending the occupation, the Israeli occupation. Formal links, it's a bit more tenuous. One, because we are very, very careful, and consequently, both Hamas and the Brotherhood are very careful about getting involved with the other, because that would lead to a very strong reaction from our side. That being said, and you know you obviously know, Egypt is not a supporter of mixing religion and politics, and the Brotherhood in Egypt is formally illegal. Hamas was elected in Palestine. Therefore, it is part of the body politique in Palestine. While we don't like religion and politics, we don't tell others what they should do. We will work with Hamas on security issues to control our border with them in a manner that's consistent with our concerns, Palestinian needs, and ultimately Israeli security needs as well. We hope to be able to push Hamas more and more towards support for a two-state solution between Palestine and Israel.
Thank you.
Ambassador, thanks for coming. I was curious about you mentioned, I think you implicitly mentioned the Arab League peace proposal in your talk. Why do you think that's been so intractable over the last few years and in large part ignored even in Annapolis in November? And what do you think needs to be done to restructure the argument?
I mean, that's a great question. And frankly, if I knew the answer, we would have done it. But, I mean, you raise a valid point. The first problem that occurred was when it was announced in Beirut initially, it came immediately before, I think, a terrorist attack or a violent attack in Tel Aviv, it was, inside Israel. So it was dampened immediately by there's this violence and consequently all of you guys are not serious, when it was actually a very serious proposal from the beginning. Secondly, and I say this very candidly, I don't think Israel wants to recognize the initiative because it brings to the forefront very clearly the embarrassing situation that Arabs are ready to actually have normal relations with Israel if you would just end the occupation. So the Israelis don't like to give prominence to that. Arabs have not done a good job in promoting the initiative. That I openly admit, we could have done a better job, but again, having started off with the Beirut incident, it was just difficult to do it then. It was acknowledged at Annapolis, by the way. I mean, it was acknowledged by President Bush in Annapolis, but I understand what you're saying. We have to find a way to show that this is to show to the public that this is a serious, sincere initiative. But we will not negotiate it any further. Because there's also an attempt that, well, some Israelis will say, well, go and explain this point or this point. Well, explain to us how you're going to end the occupation. We will not end up negotiating with ourselves. What we will do is negotiate with Israelis to achieve a peace that provides the Arabs with their rights and Israel with its right and security. But we're not going to negotiate with ourselves.
Ambassador, two questions, if I may. The first, what are, in your mind, the main reasons for the inability of Prime Minister Barak and President Arafat to reach an agreement in the last peace conference at Camp David? My second question is, how, in your mind, would the Israeli-Egyptian relations look like in 20 years?
Two difficult questions. First one is easier, actually. Well, I'll answer it. Barak and Arafat disliked each other tremendously. That was the first point. And Jim, correct me if I'm mistaken, they were almost not on speaking terms when they went to Camp David. Almost that. I mean, I went and met President Arafat before Camp David, and he said, I don't want to go to Camp David because we won't get a deal yet. We're too far apart on Jerusalem, and they're going to blame me. I went in, explained that position, and I was told, we're going to make a sincere effort, and we're not going to blame anybody. At Camp David, my understanding of what happened, Barak and Arafat met, I think, once. Besides that, they were talking to different members of the two sides and through the Americans. But they had a tremendous dislike for each other. I would add to it, however, I don't think Camp David was properly prepared for. And the timing was wrong. And Jim, correct me if I'm mistaken here, my analysis of the timing was it was in response to Barak's need to do it early to effect Israeli elections and a desire by Vice President Gore not to have it close to the American elections in November. So it went really a bit too quickly in July. Nevertheless, Camp David, I think, was useful, could have even been more useful had they not announced failure at the end of it, simply announced that we're going to try again next month. And frankly, we told them as Egyptians, we don't like the idea of going to Camp David, but we won't oppose it. And when you fail, don't announce failure because we will help in the remaining period. Egypt, Israel, you'll be surprised, frankly, if when we struck the deal with Israel, Israelis claimed that they assumed that they would see a warm peace. And we claimed that we assumed, and I can say that we did because I can speak on our behalf, I can't speak on the Israeli behalf, that this would lead to a comprehensive peace, not be simply an Egyptian-Israeli peace. Both sides are frustrated on those counts. It didn't become comprehensive for us. It wasn't warm for the Israelis. But we have peace. Everybody in the region has been arguing, including us. But our peace agreement has been sustained. Why? And this is a lesson that everybody has to draw from. Begin and Sadat did not like each other. We've had this challenge hundreds of times, the peace agreement. But because it served Egypt's interest and Israel's interest, neither side has once threatened to abrogate the treaty. It gave Egypt what it wanted, which is all its territory. We have no motivation to get into a war with Israel. We will continue to fight for peace between Palestinians and Israel, but there's no reason for us to go to war. It gave Israel what it wanted, that there was never going to be another comprehensive Arab-Israeli war, because Egypt was not part of that. And that's why it's been sustained, because they both know if it's a win-win situation, neither side will go back on it. This is the lesson we need to draw. Palestine, Israel, Syria has to be a win-win situation. If it's a balance of power, it'll break down. If it's a balance of interest, it lives on.
We're going to take one more question, but I'll just add two observations to Nabil's comments there. He and I have been having this running conversation for a long time about Camp David, and I won't get into all of it with you. But one is, as you yourself pointed out, Nabil, Begin and Sadat didn't like each other, and they didn't meet during Camp David. So the fact that Barak and Arafat didn't meet, I don't think by itself was a factor. The second thing is, from our point of view, the reason for the timing was profoundly influenced by Arafat's insistence that he had to make a unilateral declaration of independence in September of 2000. And it was quite seriously conveyed to us that he had deferred it, but felt absolutely under enormous pressure to do it. And so our sense, and I think it really was an important factor in the timing, was that something had to happen before that to avoid what we thought was going to be a breakdown. So although what happened in September, of course, was terrible and really enormously damaging, we had the same fear that the same kind of thing might happen if there were no effort in the late spring of 2000. So at least from my perspective, that had a lot to do with the timing. Your question.
Yes, Ambassador. Thank you for coming. It's been very interesting. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the consequences of the incident last week in Gaza where the Hamas government knocked down the barrier and sort of broke the Israeli siege and Israeli blockade, allowed Palestinians to go into Egypt, get goods and so forth. Does this draw Egypt into involvement in Gaza more? And I guess two related questions. Do you see Egypt playing a key role in trying to mediate between Fatah and Hamas for a future unity government or some sort of resolution of their disputes? And do you see an Egyptian role in perhaps encouraging Hamas to prevent rocket attacks on Israel that make it very hard for Israel to move forward with the peace process?
Well, what Hamas did was basically take advantage of a continuous siege around the border, assuming correctly that we would not shoot at innocent Palestinian civilians. And they were right. Because there was a siege, because this was a humanitarian situation, it was not morally acceptable for us to use force against Palestinian civilians. That's slowly changing now. We're not using force against them, but the wall has been drawn up again. There are, I think, one or two points where people are passing back and forth, so there's no siege anymore, but there's more control of the border area. We're trying to negotiate with the Europeans, with Hamas and the PA to reinvigorate the former security arrangements for the terminal, the Rafah terminal. So you have transparent, controlled passage of people, goods, and services through the terminal that provides assistance to the Palestinians and provides transparency for the Israelis. We will not take control of Gaza. That's not a viable, nor is it a serious proposal. We will not do that. We will continue to work with Hamas on security issues, as we have, by the way, to try to convince them to control any violence across their border towards Israel, and we will continue to work with Israelis, as we have, to convince them to stop targeting politicians inside Gaza and to help with Abu Mazen in the negotiating process. The brokering a deal between Abu Mazen or the PA and Hamas, politically, Palestinians need reconciliation between them. We would hope that reconciliation be supportive of a two-state solution between Palestine and Israel. Presently, what we're talking about is a security dialogue, much more than a political dialogue. Thank you.
Well, thank you all very much, and I ask you to join me in thanking Nabil Fahmy for a terrific presentation.